Hello. In both Vienna and London in the 1790s and then on into the new century, patronage played an essential role both in the production of music and in the ways it reached an audience, and perhaps indeed the nature of that audience too. That patronage is my principal theme in this short talk, but it's accompanied by a second subject, namely whether that patronage has a direct effect on the nature of the music that composers, even so eminent and so admired by their contemporaries as Haydn and Beethoven, actually composed. To take two examples, would Haydn ever have composed for the baryton if Prince Nicholas Esterhazy hadn't developed a passion for this strange and exotic instrument? And would Beethoven have embarked on his great mass, the Missa Solemnis, if Archduke Rudolf, his patron and pupil, had not asked for music for his enthronement as the Archbishop of Olmütz in 1820? I don't propose to answer either of those questions, not directly, but rather to use them to remind ourselves that both Beethoven and Haydn were dependent upon aristocratic patronage, both in making a living and achieving public renown as composers. In March 1761, aged just 29 years old, Haydn took up an appointment as Vice-Kapellmeister to the fabulously wealthy Esterhazy family, with a palace in Vienna and a castle in Eisenstadt. In time, they would turn a hunting lodge in an unpromising piece of swamp on the Austrian-Hungarian border into their own version of Versailles, and they would name it for themselves as Esterhazy. Haydn's starting salary was 400 gulden a year, with another 200 added to that unofficially, so as not to offend the senior Kapellmeister in the Esterhazy household, Gregor Josef Werner. And it's worth pointing out that Haydn's salary was twice as much as he had been paid in his previous job in another princely household. The Vice-Kapellmeister's duties were as carefully delineated as you might imagine. As a good house officer, but not, note, a servant, he was answerable for the good behaviour of the musicians in the Esterhazy establishment, and he was required to set them a good example in such matters as respect for their betters and indeed their table manners. He also recruited the musicians and trained them and any singers who were engaged for particular tasks. Haydn was obliged by his contract to appear twice a day before his prince to hear what music was wanted, and he was to compose such pieces of music as his Serene Highness shall command, and he couldn't compose for anyone else. Within a year, Prince Paul Esterhazy died, and he was succeeded by his brother, the magnificent Prince Nicholas, the baritonist, and the man who commanded the palace of Esterhazy into existence. In various ways, Haydn would be in service with and of service to this family for almost half a century until his death in 1809. Indeed, for the next generation of composers, and well on into the 20th century, this was considered not so much a life sentence, but a creative death sentence. So, in a deeply patronising passage, Robert Schumann writes, "One can learn nothing more from Haydn. He is like a regular house friend, always gladly and respectfully received, but he no longer has any deep interest for our age." In truth, then, not so much house friend really as house servant, well below the creative and the social salt, you can be sure. Nietzsche may have taken the high moral ground, but he was no less dismissive, saying, so far as genius can exist in a thoroughly virtuous man, Haydn had it. He goes to the edge of the line that morality prescribes for the intellect. He just makes music that has no past. For most of his 19th century detractors, Haydn had sold his soul for a mess of Esterhazy pottage. At worst, he was a musical lackey at the beck and call of his prince. At best, a composer constrained from writing what he wished by being compelled to cater for the tastes of his employer. The problem for Schumann, and I suspect Nietzsche, was that Haydn, quite simply, wasn't Beethoven, or indeed Mozart. For them, Haydn was a musical insider, not an outsider, not a heroic genius who had redirected the path of Western music into new forms of expression, which was what by then composers were supposed to do. Berlioz, Liszt, and above all Richard Wagner, those three self-appointed prophets for the so-called music of the future, created a new template for the idea of the composer, both in his music and in the way that he lived. To an extent, of course, they borrowed the idea of the heroic from Beethoven, and the 19th century was utterly besotted with this idea of the composer as a hero. It's not an accident that Richard Strauss named his eighth tone poem Ein Heldenleben, a hero's life, and with scarcely a trace of irony made himself the hero of his own music. By comparison with this new idea of the heroic life, Haydn's years as the Esterházy's Kapellmeister does indeed look pretty humdrum. The music, of course, actually tells a different story, but it's perhaps only in the last 50 years that we've learnt to hear that story. We're going to hear the Castellan Quartet play the String Quartet in D, Opus 76, number 2. These Opus 76 quartets, written in 1797 or 8, are the last string quartets that Haydn composed. While they are dedicated to the Hungarian Count Joseph Georg Erdődy, Haydn was still in the service of the Esterházy family when he wrote them. These are hugely ambitious works, with Haydn experimenting in both form and the relationships between his players, giving a particular prominence to the viola player and the cellist, while also playing with key signatures and tempi. Dr. Charles Burney spotted their originality and wrote at once to Haydn. They are full of invention, fire, good taste and new effects, and seem the production not of a sublime genius who has written so much and so well already, but of one of highly cultivated talents who has expended none of his fire before. This is certainly not a composer playing it safe, writing music by the yard. But what does Haydn himself say about his supposed servitude? He famously told his first biographer, Georg August Griesinger, "My prince was happy with all my works. I received approval. I could, as head of an orchestra, experiment, see what enhanced and what weakened an effect, this improving, adding to, cutting away and running risks. I was set apart from the world. There was nobody nearby to confuse or annoy me in my curse, so I couldn't help becoming original." These, I think, are scarcely the words of a man cringing behind the green baize door, waiting to be summoned into the presence. Haydn acknowledges the social gap between him and Prince Nicholas Esterházy, but notice the use of the possessive, my prince, and how two my's go on to become the first person singular, I received approval. But it's the main part, I think, of what Griesinger reports that is significant. The idea that detached from the world with an orchestra and subsequently a whole opera company at Esterházy, Haydn was granted a kind of artistic freedom that allowed him to experiment. In 1779, Haydn signed a new contract with Prince Nicholas. Haydn's biographers have tended to stress the increase in his annual stipend to what was effectively a comfortable middle-class salary. And they've noted the removal of those slightly demeaning clauses from the first contract about the composer refraining from undue familiarity and from vulgarity in eating, drinking and conversations. But of greater significance, I would argue, are the clauses in the contract that now allow Haydn to accept outside commissions and to enter into negotiations with publishers. This perhaps tells us a number of things. Firstly, that Prince Nicholas now trusts his Kapellmeister to remain in his service. Indeed, such is his reputation that other patrons wish to have music from him which serves both the interests of the master and the musician. Haydn will be able to augment his income, while his success elsewhere will enhance the reputation of Prince Nicholas as a man of taste and discrimination in the eyes and ears of his fellow aristocrats. Secondly, Haydn was now free to enter into negotiations with publishers. In other words, to become part of one of the new developments in the production of music in the late 18th century. It wasn't that music hadn't been published before, but that music publishing was burgeoning as the numbers of people who wanted to play music right across Europe was growing. The aristocracy, of course, but also the newly rich and the rising bourgeoisie. And Vienna, as often, they were ennobled a new haute bourgeoisie. Remember Herr von Faninal in Der Rosenkavalier? In Vienna, Haydn now began to frequent their houses and to acquire a taste for the musical culture of the capital that colours his attitudes to life out at Esterházy or indeed the castle at Eisenstadt. The story behind the Farewell Symphony No. 45 is often told. Haydn and his musicians, growing tired of their Hungarian exile, play the Symphony of Prince Nicholas and in the final movement, one by one, end their parts, blow out the candles on their music stands and leave the hall. The prince got the message and his court returned to Vienna. That was at the beginning of the 1770s. Nearly 2 decades later, the feeling of exile had become all the more acute after Haydn had been feted by all of musical Vienna. This is what he wrote then to Frau von Grenziger in a celebrated letter in February 1790. Well, here I sit, my wilderness, forsaken like a poor waif almost without human company, sad, full of memories of past glorious days, and who knows when those days will return again. Those wonderful parties where the whole circle is one heart, one soul, all the beautiful musical evenings. Here, for 3 days, I did not know if I was a Kapellmeister or Kapell servant. Nothing could console me. My whole house was in disorder. My forte piano, which I usually love, was perverse and disobedient. And then, just as I was happily dreaming that I was listening to Le Nozze di Figaro, the ghastly north wind woke me up and almost blew my nightcap off my head. The question here, immediately, is had Haydn changed? Had he grown weary of the traditional mode of patronage that he had lived under since entering the servants of the Esterházy family as a young man? Or did he understand that the traditional pattern of patronage itself was now changing? After all, he had met Mozart in Vienna, and Mozart was endeavouring to make a living as a freelance composer by organising subscription concerts in the city, albeit for the aristocracy for the most part, and also publishing his music. Think of those final remarkable piano concertos. Later, in the spring of 1790, he laments in another letter to Frau von Grenziger, "It is sad always to be a slave, but Providence wills it so." Now Providence smiled on Haydn. Prince Nicholas Esterházy died in September 1790. His son, Prince Anton, dismissed most of his father's musicians, and Haydn, with a pension of 2,000 gulden a year, was free. First to move to Vienna, and then in time to make the second most important journey of his life to London, for a first visit in 1791 in the company of the man who had wooed him to England, Johann Peter Salomon. Haydn arrived in the capital on January the 2nd, 1791, and all of fashionable London was out in force to meet the most celebrated composer of the age. He wrote home, "My arrival caused a great sensation throughout the whole city, and I went the round of all the newspapers for 3 successive days. Everyone wants to know me. I had to dine out 6 times up to now, and if I wanted, I could dine out every day. But first I must consider my health, and second, my work. Except for the ability then, I admit no callers till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 4 o'clock I dine at home with Salomon." Salomon, a violinist and conductor, was also an impresario and responsible for programming the city's premier concert venue, the Hanover Square Rooms, in the heart of London's fashionable West End. Haydn was to play and conduct his own music from the pianoforte in a series of subscription concerts, and the choicest morsel on the menu was a set of 6 new symphonies written specially for London, numbers 93 to 98. However, it was 3 months before London heard a note of these new symphonies. At last, on February the 11th, 1791, Haydn took his place at the pianoforte in front of Salomon's orchestra in the Hanover Square Rooms, and there, amongst the audience, was the musicologist Dr. Charles Burney, one of an enormous crowd of over 800 people. He would later record, "The sight of the composer so electrified the audience as to excite the attention and pleasure superior to any that had ever, to my knowledge, been caused by orchestral music in England." Alerted to that great English tradition of late coming, plus ça change, you may feel, Haydn had cunningly arranged for the new symphony to be played after the interval. The critics reached for superlatives. The symphony was received with the highest applause. The audience was so enraptured that by unanimous desire the second movement was encored, and the third was vehemently demanded a second time also. This time Haydn drew the line at repeating the minuet allegro, but he was delighted with the English practice of applauding each movement and insisting on an immediate encore if it pleased. "I created a furore with this new symphony," he reported home, "and they had to repeat the adagio. This had never before occurred in London. Imagine what it means to hear such a thing from an Englishman's lips." London, at the end of the 18th century, was one of Europe's fastest growing cities, and one of its richest too. As the memoirs of the estimable Dr. Burney remind us, it had developed a sophisticated public performance culture centred on halls like the Hanover Rooms, where people of all classes were permitted to subscribe to concert seasons. In no sense in London was music the preserve of the aristocracy. Indeed, the enthusiasm that Haydn's orchestral music aroused seems to have been greatest amongst the middle classes, although the British royal family did take a close interest. Within weeks of his arrival, Haydn was nodded to by the Prince of Wales at an evening party. He thought Prince George was the most handsome man on God's earth, even if he did later have to chase him for an unpaid account. And when George III observed that Haydn had written much music, the composer replied with ineffable tact, "Yes, sir, a great deal more than is good." For his first visit to London, Haydn composed new symphonies, an opera that was alas never performed, a stream of orchestral music and chamber works too. And in less than 4 months, in 1792, as well as composing, he played at 22 concerts. But he was well rewarded by these visits. In the 2 years of his second trip to London, the composer earned 12,000 gulden, the equivalent of 12 years' salary in the service of the Esterhazy family. Haydn had found an English public clamouring for music that they could hear in the Hanover Rooms and also play at home. Publishers couldn't get enough chamber music, quartets, trios, etc. These were scores that were cheap to engrave and easy to sell to the rising aspirant middle classes, so keen to show themselves and their neighbours that they possessed taste and discrimination. If Haydn was able to reap the commercial successes that flowed from new patterns in the production and consumption of serious music at the end of the 18th century, then Beethoven is supposed to have initiated a new paradigm of the sturdily independent composer following his own furrow and reaching over the heads of traditional Viennese aristocratic patrons to a new audience where alle Menschen werden Brüder. So there's Beethoven's celebrated remark to Prince Karl Lichnowsky. "Prince, you are what you are through the accident of birth. What I am through myself. There have been and will be thousands of princes. There is only one Beethoven." When young, Frau von Bernhard came to Vienna to study piano with Beethoven, and she met him after he had turned his back on court dress, choosing to present himself, as she says, in the informal fashion of the other side of the Rhine, almost badly dressed. You have to ask yourself if Beethoven was perhaps playing a part. Not that he didn't believe in the image of the composer that he was projecting, but in the sense that he wanted people to understand that the age of the Kapellmeister, the court musical servant, the age of wigs and silk stockings was over. The idea here might be that the composer was now his own man, beholden to nothing but his own genius. If Beethoven admired Bonaparte before he crowned himself emperor, it was perhaps because the Corsican was an extraordinary example of self-made greatness. As Beethoven said of Bonaparte to his friend Wenzel Krumpholz, "It's a shame that I do not understand the art of war as well as I do music. I would conquer him." Beethoven transformed self-made greatness into genius, an entirely new model of the heroic. Indeed, within less than 4 years of his arrival in Vienna, he was being hailed as a hero and much more. This comes from a survey of the Viennese music world published by Johann Ferdinand von Schoenfeld in 1796. Beethoven, a musical genius, has chosen Vienna as his residence for the past 2 years. He is widely admired for the unusual velocity of his piano playing and is astounding in the way he masters the most formidable difficulties with the greatest of ease. He seems already to have entered into the inner sanctuary of music, distinguishing himself for his precision, feeling and taste. If Bonaparte provided Beethoven with a model of the heroic, it was matched for him, I think, in the plays and writings of Schiller. And we know from a visitor to Beethoven in 1824, towards the end of the composer's life, that of the native poets he studies Schiller and Goethe in preference to any other. As his biographer Lewis Lockwood writes, "It seems beyond doubt that Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of man informed Beethoven's view of the potential power of art and music to enlighten individuals and society in a new way and to bring them to higher levels of understanding and behaviour." So, what do we have? Well, surely the heroic artist, Shelley's unacknowledged legislator of the world, raising mankind's eyes to the heavens, as in Schiller's Ode to Joy that Beethoven will set as the final movement of his Ninth Symphony. Ahnest du den Schöpferwelt? Such ihn über Sternenzelt, über Sternen muss wohnen. Do you sense the creator world? Seek him beyond the starry canopy, beyond the stars he must dwell. But someone had to pay the piper, and for all of his fierce independence, Beethoven was as reliant on aristocratic patronage in Vienna as musicians had been in the previous generation. As Tia Denora notes in her book Beethoven and the Construction of Genius, although aristocratic leadership in music affairs remained constant, the substantive content of that leadership changed. The sources of distinction shifted from simple quantitative expenditure to qualitative demonstrations of discernment and good taste, and to a heightened emphasis on the appreciation of greatness, from which derived the notion of master composers. These are the motives that encourage members of the Viennese aristocracy to support Beethoven. We know that of the 30 or so aristocratic patrons associated with this composer, at least 20 had works dedicated to them. It was probably thanks to Count Waldstein, who had supported the young composer in Bonn and who will eventually lend his name to a piano sonata, that Beethoven made his way into Viennese aristocratic circles. It was Prince Karl Lichnowsky who gave the composer a home when he first arrived in Vienna, and in 1801 an annual pension of 600 florins, which he continued to pay until 1806. Lichnowsky, who had been close to Mozart, had arranged a tour for that composer to Prague, Dresden, Leipzig and Berlin. In 1789 and in 1796 he did exactly the same for Beethoven, once again introducing him to music patrons in the four cities. Prince Franz Josef Maximilian von Lobkowitz allowed his private orchestra to take part in rehearsals of the Eroica Symphony before its first public performance. He commissioned Beethoven's first set of string quartets, 6 in all, in 1798, And in 1809 he joined with Prince Kinsky and the Archduke Rudolf to pay Beethoven an annual payment of 4,000 florins, an annuity to keep the composer in Vienna when he was being tempted by Jerome Bonaparte's office of the post of Kapellmeister in the new Kingdom of Westphalia. Archduke Rudolf, a younger brother of the Emperor Franz I, and destined to become the Archbishop of Olmütz, was not only Beethoven's patron but his pupil too, and completed perhaps 25 works for his teacher. In return, there was the Archduke Trio, the Piano Sonata Les Adieux or Les Bevols, the fourth and fifth piano concertos, the Hammerklavier Sonata, and so forth. And the Moonlight Sonata, Opus 27, number 2, from which Freddie Kempf is going to play the first movement for us, was dedicated to another aristocratic student, the Countess Giulietta Guiccardi, in 1802. But teaching, annuities, commissions and gifts did not put bread on a table as securely as a Kapellmeister's salary. So 1811 and 1812 were bad years financially for Beethoven. The currency was devalued in March 1811, and in November 1812 Prince Kinsky suddenly died. These difficulties were compounded by Prince Lobkowitz's bankruptcy. Of the composer's principal patrons, only the Archduke Rudolf remained in funds. If you'll allow me a metaphor, I think Beethoven was caught in a corridor between the old world of the Kapellmeister, attached to a princely house and with an annual salary, and the new world that was coming into being in the 19th century, where music was made at home and in public concert halls and attended by a brand new middle-class audience. Many of the Kapellmeisters had departed when their princely patrons disbanded their private orchestras. This seems to have followed a decision within the imperial household to disband the Hofkapelle, the court orchestra. Now, for the richest members of the older Austrian aristocracy, there was no longer a need to keep up with the Habsburgs. But they continued, I think, to try to control the consumption of serious music, but in new ways. Indeed, you can argue that the aristocracy effectively hindered the development of public musical life in Vienna, because they feared that it would undermine their hold on musical culture. And above all, they would have to share the notion of discernment, the very thing which marked them out as different and which of course also buttressed their cultural and maybe political power, and their privilege above their social inferiors. And the musicians? They are pulling in the opposite direction. Tia Denora again. Because the decline of the Hauskapellen had a destabilising effect on musical occupations, the new quasi-freelance musicians now had an economic interest in widening their circle of admirers and in furthering their reputations. It is also becoming clear the subscription concerts at the various halls and theatres in Vienna are not quite what some historians have thought, namely evidence of an extension of musical patronage beyond the traditionally noble audience. It would seem that the principal subscribers may well be those members of the aristocracy who continue to wish, as Tia Denora has said to us, to control musical culture. Men, and perhaps women too, who led socially and culturally even if they no longer played chamber music, as Count Andreas Razumovsky did when he commissioned Beethoven in 1806 to compose a set of 3 string quartets that would bear his name. The second of which, in E minor, the Castellan Quartet are going to play for us. The 3 Razumovsky quartets were published a year after their first performance in Vienna, and so we arrive at publishing as a means of earning a living. And before we censure Beethoven for his dealings with German-speaking publishers, morally elastic, as a friend of mine puts it, we need to remind ourselves that there was no copyright protection of the kind we take for granted nowadays. As Lewis Lockwood notes, at the end of his splendidly accessible life of Beethoven and his works, the facts and issues regarding the maze of Beethoven's later dealings with publishers can be summarised in a few words. So much of Beethoven's correspondence is with publishers and about publications of his music because his career ambitions, his financial worries and obsessive mentality gave him no alternative. Rejecting or failing to secure any permanent court position and having his only source of steady income, the annuity bestowed on him by Kinsky, Lobkowitz and Archduke Rudolf, Beethoven really needed to sell his works for his livelihood. I should like to end with Beethoven in his own words. This comes from an unpublished draft statement about a proposed complete edition of his works that was found amongst the composer's papers when he died. Beethoven had written, "The law books begin without much ado with a discussion of human rights, which nevertheless the executors trample underfoot. This author begins his statement. An author has the right to arrange for a revised edition of his works. But since there are so many greedy brain pickers and lovers of that noble dish, since all kinds of preserves, ragouts and fricassees are made from it which go to fill the pockets of the pastry cooks, and since the author would be glad to have as many groschen as sometimes paid for his work, the author is determined to show that the human brain cannot be sold either like coffee beans or like any form of cheese, which, as everyone knows, must first be produced from milk, urine and so forth. The human brain in itself is not a saleable commodity." Thank you.